Hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Ellis, and I thank you for tuning in to Justice for the 110 podcast. I'm excited to have a brilliant guest on for us today. It's Ben Raines, who is an award-winning journalist, environmental journalist, filmmaker, and chartered captain who lives in Fairhope, Alabama with his wife, beautiful wife. But more importantly, he is the author of The Last Slave Ship. For those that can see the visual, he's the author of The Last Slave Ship, the true story of how Clotilda was found, her descendants, and an extraordinary reckoning. Welcome to the show, Ben. How are you today?
I'm good, Jeremy. Thanks for having me on. It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you again.
Thanks for that kind intro.
Absolutely, absolutely, well deserved. How does it feel? I don't know if you can still consider yourself a journalist, but how does it, or a reporter? But how does it feel, given your background, and now be sitting in the seat of the interviewee and not the interviewer?
I'm happy with it. I'm comfortable with it. You know, I've been interviewing people for 25 years, and so a little turnaround is fair play. No, I'm happy to be interviewed, especially about this topic.
Absolutely, absolutely. So for those that know me, know that I am a sixth generation descendant of Polly and Rose Allen, who were two of the enslaved Africans on Clotilda. And so anything that's written about Clotilda, anything that pertains to my ancestors, I am going to definitely take time out of my day to divulge and read the material. And so I think Ben did a good job of adding more context to the story. So I definitely want to spend some time talking about your book. That was one of the things that Ben and I, when we spoke, I promised him I would read the book before the interview, and I did completely. Actually, I read it in about 2.5 days. It was a pretty quick read for me. But how long did it take you to actually write the book?
Well, it took longer than anticipated because of the pandemic. So I actually got a lot more time. I wrote the original version of the book physically wrote it in about 4 or 5 months. But I had a deadline. And so basically I wrote it between May, when the discovery was announced, and
May of 2019.
February.
May of 2019.
Right. And February, when my manuscript was due. But in between there, I still had to, make a living other ways and all. And I traveled to Benin as part of all that and stuff. So I turned it in and, kind of skidded in at the deadline, and met the deadline and everything. And so Simon & Schuster told me, look, I turned it in February of 2019. The pandemic started
February 2020.
Oh, 2020. Yeah, I get confused about the dates. You're right. So the pandemic started about a month later, and I was still waiting on the edit to come back from Simon & Schuster at the time. And I got word that they were delaying 150 books that were supposed to publish that spring until the following fall, which is when my book was supposed to publish. And they just said, look, you're going to be delayed a year. And I, kicked and screamed a little because I wanted the book to come out, because I thought it was important, for Africatown and the moment. And then realized, okay, they've given me a year to work on it. And so I took it back. And so I spent that whole year polishing it and making it stronger and better. And the book was much, much improved because of that extra time. Any writer that gets told, okay, you got a year to play with, you're going to jump on it. And I did. So really it took almost 2 years probably in all the writing. And that's not counting the research that began before the writing process. The research started in 2017.
And you kind of talk about a lot of this in the book, and I do want to dive deep into the book because I have some things that I really liked about the book. I thought that chapter 5 and chapter 6 were exceptional because they provided insight into the story that I felt like hasn't been told yet. And so I'm curious about your chapter.
Now, just for your listeners, tell them what those chapters are.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I was gonna do that, but
okay,
to your point. So chapter 5 is entitled Bear Coon, and then chapter 6 is the Into the Canebrake. And so we'll dive deep into it, and I'll kind of share why. But one thing I thought the book did was, for me, I'm someone that read all the books. I've read
Right.
Sylvia Ann Dufa's book. I've interviewed her. I've read the book from Dr. Robertson and know her well. I actually read the agricultural report that
Mm-hmm.
Search Inc. did. So for me, I saw a lot of those items in your book as well. But one thing that you did that I thought was exceptional was fill in the gaps with some of the details that those books don't include, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But but before we get into that, what interests you about this particular story, and you talk about it, but kind of for the audience, what drew your attention to this to finding Clotilda?
Well, when it started, it was just a mystery that needed to be solved. And I approached it that way. A buddy of mine called me up and said, you should go look for the Clotilda. And I was kind of like, is it lost? I knew the Clotilda story here in Mobile. I'd been an investigative reporter here for, close to 20 years at the time. But I knew it as the last slave ship that came into America with enslaved people on board. I didn't understand the criminal element, that it had happened 50 years after the Atlantic trade had been outlawed. I didn't understand that they had burned the ship to hide it in the swamp and all that. I would drive by, I wrote stories in Africatown, environmental stories about, the environmental legacies left there by all the heavy industry and everything. And I would drive by the Clotilda mural, but it was when that friend called me and told me to look for it. And then he kind of gave me the Cliff Notes version of the story with the burning and all that stuff. And so that kind of hooked me right then. But even then, I didn't understand the sort of human dimensions of the story and what it would mean for the African diaspora, even globally, because it is the origin story of everybody whose ancestors arrived in the Americas in the hold of a ship, and there's no other story like it that has the whole history. But that isn't what wrote me in at first. At first, I was just a reporter who was going to try and solve this mystery, and dug into it that way, going to the primary historical documents. I really didn't understand the power of the story when I started. And so as I started doing the research, the story taught me its power as I went. And part of that, you're talking about the Barracoon chapter and the chapter before, which is kind of about Cudjo's life in Africa, particularly Cudjo, because we have the best record of his life thanks to Barracoon. And so that was all a really illuminating process, understanding what kind of an idyllic world that many of these people were ripped from, they always talked about how in America you had to work so hard compared to their lives in Africa. And when you go to Benin and you see it's fecundity of the environment, things grow year round and it's lush and beautiful. So the thing that drew me to those chapters and to writing them, that it got me excited about that, was I was learning new stuff every page. Everything in those chapters is new to me, stuff I didn't learn in my history classes, going to public schools in the South and even up in the Northeast. That element, I think, is sorely missing from the education of all Americans, regardless of their race. And, it's one of those things, without that history, without that stuff, you can't really understand the past. You know what I mean? And so I think we got to do a lot better job with exactly the things in those chapters to really get at, the true tragedy of the whole era of enslavement. So it was an eye-opening education, reading and learning what it took to build those chapters.
And from your research and your findings, what stood out the most to you, or what's that one theme, that common theme that kind of that you're hoping that the book tells?
Well, the two most powerful things about the people who arrived on the Clotilda are that they stuck together and they fought back. And they did those two things immediately from when they arrived on the various plantations they were put on. We have multiple stories about them fighting back. There's the famous story of them taking when the overseer on Timothy Mayer's plantation whipped the woman, they attacked him and took the whip and beat him with it. And then there's the story of them coming in the house and chasing Mayer's wife up into a bedroom because her, paid cook had slapped one of the Africans. So right there you see that, and then you see it going forward in the stories about them trying to vote despite people trying to prevent them. In the stories, just even building a school for their kids, building their own church, and all of that they were being persecuted by both, the Reconstruction era South, but also by the American-born blacks who were newly freed as well. They did not embrace the Africans. So really, it was kind of an us against them for the Clotilda crew. And I think they found a lot of power in that. And we can, as a nation even, we can get a lot of power from that, stick together and fight back.
No, that's true. You raised a few points. One of the stories I tell is Polly Allen was involved in the voting story. That's one story that I've regurgitated and I've told a number of people. The other story I was familiar with, the one of them attacking on Timothy Mayer's plantation. I had not heard, so this was new to me, the one about the Page Cook story and them going into the house. So that was new information to me that I learned from the book. So those are the type of things I'm kind of curious in your research. For example, one thing that stood out to me in the research that you did was the detail. I spoke about chapter 5, Barracoon, and I spoke about chapter 6 in the Crane Break. Your level of detail with those particular, when they arrived and the burning of the ship and the gun, Captain Foster holding up his crew and that sort of thing. So what I'm curious in is, how did you get your level of detail? Where did you get that information from?
Well, so multiple sources, and combining them, that's one of the beautiful things about the story of the Clotilda people is how many times they were interviewed. And in multiple newspaper interviews, I found things in newspaper articles that I've never seen anywhere else.
For example, Noah Hart was a new character that I had not heard of, and that was the first time I've heard of Noah Hart, which now I'm curious to go look up more interviews that he's done, and I think you did a good job of capturing that. I guess what I'm asking is,
well, it's just that
was any of this information? What you say?
I said it's just that one interview with him.
Okay.
That was done by that woman from Mobile. So I'm coming at this from a different place than the authors of the other books you mentioned. They're academics. Sylvia and Juve, Natalie, they're PhD academics, and so they wrote very scholarly, very dense books. They're just full of information of all kinds. Mm-hmm. But it's presented kind of in that format almost. And I tried to make my book as readable as possible for capturing everybody from people like you to a 12-year-old, to an 80-year-old white lady in Minnesota. You know what I mean? I wanted the story to be accessible to everyone and have its power. And part of the way to do that is to use people, you know what I mean? And let them speak with their voices and things. So, the Noah Hart stuff, that interview really spoke to me in a variety of ways. And, that information, like Sylviane used a lot of the information in that interview, which was a magazine article, to figure out where the people on the Clotilda were from, based on words he used in the interview and things like that. So they were clues for her as well. And that's kind of you hope when you do a book about a history that's already been written about, you bring something to the table and add something, you know what I mean? And so my whole career has been digging into historical research and stuff and try and find the path from, what happened to today as true as possible.
I think I guess what I was getting at, so I do think you did a good job of interweaving. Like I saw the connection in Barracoon with Barracoon and Sylvia Ann Doofus' book, and you being able to kind of merge what Cujo had been saying with what Dr. Doof had written and kind of merge and tell a story. I saw that. I guess what I'm asking is how much of your book you do cite Amir as a resource, but I was curious specifically in those two chapters, how much of those stories were captured from members of the Mir family?
Essentially none.
Okay.
Only in interviews that Timothy and then his son gave. His son, the story about the bet.
And when I say the Mir family, I'm saying those that are living and alive. That's what I'm
living.
So I'm specifically
in those chapters.
Okay.
And I will tell you that the one member of the Mayer family who would talk to me, who died about a month ago, I think he knew where the ship was because I know his brother knew where the ship was, Joe Mayer, and I think that the brother that was willing to talk to me knew where the ship was. When I found the first ship, he said, when it was revealed it wasn't the ship, he said, well, it's a lot further south than there, I think. I think it's down, close to Africa Town. And I don't know if he was just lying to me to put me off the trail, but he told me an elaborate story about some man who had discovered where the ship was in the 80s or 90s, and they were going to meet and go to the ship together, and the man had a heart attack and died without ever telling anybody where it was, which, is kind of preposterous. The ship is sitting next to a piece of swamp that the Mayers have owned since the 1850s, and they have a house on that same stretch of river, and they have concrete pilings up and down the river that have their name on it. So the modern day Mayers contributed nothing of value to those chapters.
Okay.
Other than I will say this, that fellow did point me toward the captain's journal, Captain Foster's journal that was in the library. And he told me the story of how it ended up there, which was kind of fascinating.
Okay. Well, that's good to know because I was so intrigued by your level of detail. It almost sounded like firsthand account from that may have been passed down within the Mir family, which is you know as well as I know, they've been very reluctant to speak on this matter. And you actually mentioned this in one of the later chapters about how their participation would help to add more clarity and because for me, for example, through research, I've been able to find a lot of information on Polly Allen, but I haven't been able to find a lot of research on Rose Allen. There's not a lot of documented information on a number of the women that were on the ship. So I would be curious from a Mir family perspective, what artifacts that they have and what can they share with me pertaining to her and the other descendants. The other 110 that were on the ship.
Now, I will tell you this, and it's not in the book because I've just learned it recently, but I spoke to a longtime family friend of the Mayer family who told me that Joe Mayer, who was the oldest of Timothy Mayer's great-grandsons, who died in 2020, has the steering wheel out of the ship at his house. And I've heard that there's a trunk in the house full of Clotilda-related artifacts, including a written document from Dahomey outlining the sale. Now, this is all rumor and speculation, but I believe it. And I think they do have those sort of art items. The fact that Foster's descendants had, they had the chair and the desk out of the captain's cabin, as well as the clock and the captain's journal, and tried to sell these things to one of the Mayers. That's pretty fascinating. So, and the Mayers didn't buy the items for $18,000, even though they're multi-millionaires, which suggests they have some artifacts of their own, maybe, when you think about, well, why would he take the desk and the chair and the clock? Well, those are very valuable items you could put on a new ship, right? If you're going to burn the ship up, a desk would be a high level of carpentry. and light enough that you and another guy could carry it off the ship and save it. And so I suspect they saved a lot of removable items from the ship because Foster built ships for a living. So I think there are a number of items that are probably waiting to be put in the new museum in Africatown.
And for the listeners, everything that Ben is sharing with us is discussed, and he does share these same stories in chapters in this book. So I definitely recommend you all, if you're interested in this story, definitely getting the book and kind of reading and learning some of these stories. Before I pivot to the actual ship and some of the discussions that you and I have had, a few more questions on this topic. The Mear family. Have any of them reached out to you directly since you've located Clotilda and or since your book has come out?
No, the opposite is true. They have avoided me since the ship Discovery was announced. In particular, Gus Mear, who is the last of those three great-grandsons still alive, was I was a speaker at a lawyer conference that he was at. And I was the speaker in a big session that everybody was supposed to attend. And multiple of his friends told me he was coming, and he didn't show up. So he avoided the chance to be in the room with me talking about the Clotilda. I called various members of the Mear family over and over, including the children who are grown, they're 50-year-old people, of these three great-grandsons. Nobody would talk to me about anything related to the ship except the one brother, Robert, who's now deceased. But what's so interesting about that family is Robert was he and his brothers hadn't spoken in many years apparently, and he had been kicked out of the family business in a dispute over some of the Civil War money inheritance. Then at the time of Joe Mear's death, the oldest of the three brothers, he's being sued by Gus, the middle brother, and Gus's children, because they figured out that Joe Mear had stolen $1 million from them in rent due to them for the properties they owned together. So that family is still being torn apart by the legacy of the Clotilda and this, the wealth that they generated during the slavery era. I just thought that was
and you do a very good job of even sharing that story in the book about the disputes that they've had amongst the three grandsons, and then the suit with Joe and Augustine and his children. So they're fascinating. And then final question on that is, have they tried to sue you, or has anyone tried to in that regard?
No, they have not tried to sue me. Maybe that's coming. The lawyers at Simon & Schuster definitely went through the book and removed anything they thought would leave us vulnerable to a suit. I don't think nothing in there is untrue. So to be sued for libel, you have to be printing something to be untrue, and that's not happening. The history here is what it is. They're just choosing to hide from it because they don't like their role in it. And I could understand that. They have a sad legacy in all this. I really regret that they did not embrace the chance to step out from under that burden, the way Mike Foster did, Captain Foster's descendant who came and met with y'all here in Mobile. The Mears, I don't understand the reluctance today with them to do that. It just sort of seems like they could just say, our ancestors did this, we're sorry, and walk back out into the light and join the rest of us, instead of, they're kind of in this bunker mentality, thinking that if they just keep their mouths shut, it'll all go away, but it'll never go away, in that regard. And to that end, Joe Mear was famously racist. I was told he wanted to cut me in half with a sword. And, a few weeks before he died in March of 2020. He was in one of the fanciest restaurants in Mobile, and the maitre d' tried to sit him next to an African-American couple. And he loudly refused and started using the N-word in the restaurant and made a huge scene and was sat at another table. So, this is a few weeks before the guy dies. He's still, espousing virulent racist things in public. you know.
And they're still one of the wealthiest families in Mobile, and they still have a lot of
Yeah,
influence and power within the city. For example, which I think was done not in good faith, was, you recall, maybe a year ago or so, or a few months ago, when they sold the old credit union building to the city of Mobile.
yeah,
And the city of Mobile paid $50,000 for now a building that they found out that is going to need to be demolished due to the
hmm
cost of renovations, which I was extremely disappointed. And I want to be clear here. I was extremely disappointed at the Mobile Mayor Sandy Stimpson at his
yeah,
regard for holding a conference, a news conference, a press conference to announce this action. Personally, I think it was done not in good faith. I think the Mir family felt some of the heat from the national attention that was taking place
yeah.
with this story and how it was, I guess, tarnishing their family's name. And so they wanted to, in good faith, do a good deed. And I don't think so. So I was extremely disappointed at the mayor's actions. When I say the mayor, Sandy Stimpson's action in holding that conference, for not doing a thorough investigation or inspection, not investigation, but inspection of that building. And I just, it was a slap in the face for
Absolutely.
so many descendants and people in Africa Town.
Well, and he was trying to do it on behalf of the Mayer family, kind of get them off the hook without them having to be present. The whole thing was just absurd. And, you know, that's, to me, one of the big tragedies that's come in the aftermath of the discovery of the ship is the total, just the pathetic response of the city of Mobile. They should be embracing this, and they should be championing building a museum to house the Clotilda artifacts, not talking about this crappy old credit union building and how that's somehow a gift to the community. You know, you've been to Africa Town. The community needs a lot more than another rundown, crappy building sitting next to the paper mill. And it deserves a lot more. And it was the city that forced Africa Town into the state it's in now. You know, Africa Town could have survived all the industrialization around it if they hadn't run that giant highway right through the heart of town, destroying the commercial district, destroying the last cabins built by the Africans in 1992. And, you know, the other part that always really outrages me when I start thinking about it, that route, the bridge and that highway through Africa Town, that's the hazardous waste route for every truck going along I-10. They purposely sent them through the heart of Africa Town to keep them out of downtown Mobile. I mean, that's just, you know, you can't put a finer point on systemic racism, you know, environmental justice issues than that. The city said, all right, let's get these hazardous waste out of our neighborhoods and put them over in Africa Town.
And I think you did a good job.
You know.
And you even in one of the chapters of the book, I'm trying to look it up now, and Africa Town and the Fall, you did an excellent job of describing, I think, even how my ancestor, Polly Allen, had his land essentially taken from him, and in order for the highway and those things to be developed or to be installed.
Well, and they took their land in the 20s.
Yeah.
You know, that was the first, they took their land back then.
You
know, in addition to again and again through the years. Yeah, it's
absolutely.
Just, you know, and that's a classic American story for minority communities.
It is. And so last question on this, and then we'll pivot to you finding the Clotilda. But has the city of so you've been very vocal and you've been extremely loud on telling this story and being an ally for Africa Town and the injustices, et cetera. Has the city of Mobile spoken with you, or have you spoken with any representative about your comments or kind of their plans to improve tourism or anything around Africa Town?
So I have a number of people who speak to me on behalf of Mayor Stimson telling me, oh, well, the mayor says there's a bunch of things happening that you don't know about that are going to be great for Africatown. And I say, okay, I'll talk about them as soon as I know about them. Right now, all I know about is them doing nothing. So we've gone back and forth that way. And I have, to those same people who have approached me on behalf of the mayor, carrying messages from him, I have sent my various articles about what the city needs to do, particularly about getting behind a museum and saying, if the mayor wants to get out in front of this issue, this is what he should be doing. He should be championing the creation of a museum in Africatown. It would be nothing but a boon for the city of Mobile. It's kind of moronic for, the mayor of a city not to want to bring something like a museum housing the Clotilda and telling the story of the people on it. You know what I mean? Like the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, $1 billion impact on their tax base. The same thing would happen here in Mobile, and it would be right in Africatown, which is in the city of Mobile. It's just a win-win, except it appears our leaders are too stupid to see it.
Or they know. I wouldn't say that they're too stupid. They're intentionally, their actions are very intentional, and we don't know the reason behind it. Maybe it's, who knows, but they're not stupid. There's a reason behind it. Let's pivot a little bit to you actually finding Clotilda, which is
sure.
Kind of what brought this story to light. And I'm interested in your involvements particularly. I'm extremely, friendly. I've told you this offline, but personally, I think you should get credit for finding Clotilda. You found Clotilda. And I'll say that on this podcast, and feel okay about it. But then also there's the other piece of that I've heard that you didn't find it, Clotilda. But can you kind of clear up your involvement in actually discovering Clotilda and kind of some of the back and forth that's been going on with you and the Historical Commission and searching?
Yeah, I don't want to get too far down that road, but there are two things that happened. One was the hunt for the ship, in the historical records, and I've kind of come to realize I really found Clotilda in a library, as opposed to, I did find it out in this muddy swamp too, but the swamp is about 13 miles wide and 60 miles long. It is 250,000 acres. And that's why Clotilda had never been found, because that's a huge area to search. So in the library with the historical records, I honed in on 12 Mile Island. And I honed in on it, and everybody who'd ever looked for it before had followed all these misleading interviews Timothy Mayer gave.
With the University of Southern Mississippi.
Right. Well, but see, that was a second step. So I found primary sources, including an interview with Cujo that I don't know that anybody else had ever found or read, and the Captain's Journal, that led me to 12 Mile Island. Everybody else who had looked for it had followed the mayor in these interviews where he said it was all these other places. So getting to 12 Mile Island was the key to start with. And so, it was the historical references and documents that led me to 12 Mile Island. So I went there, and of course I found the wrong ship first. I found a different schooner that was of the right age. But when I first went, I just went on
by the way you brought the audience in and you told the story about how you and Jim were out there, and essentially it was too long.
Yeah.
They knew it, and he kind of broke it to you easy, and you talk about how the community found out, and you got a hug from one of the, I can't even remember, one of the descendants maybe.
Thelma Mabin Owens.
Yeah, then you went and had you some whiskey and.
Well, I had failed on an international stage. I wrote an article about the first ship I found, which was in January of 2018. I actually found that ship on January 2nd, and I wrote the article about January 23rd, I think, after I had taken archaeologists to the site and a shipwright, a guy who's expert in building old ships and stuff, or rebuilding. And all agreed this is the right era, it's a schooner, it's the right design and everything. So then I write that story, and it goes viral internationally. And, So much so that the ambassador of Benin was on my boat 2 days later to go to the site to apologize on behalf of his country for what they had done to the people on
And
the
did the
flotilla.
voodoo ritual. He did the voodoo ritual, right?
Well, he did, but then another fella came and did the Pope of Voodoo basically came
Okay.
and did one as well on the actual wreck.
Okay. Yeah,
Now,
I remember.
so the first ship, we have this big meeting, and everybody's so disappointed that it's not Clotilda, and then everybody left. And so at the meeting where they announced it wasn't Clotilda, there were people crying. People had shirts that said our ship has come in. People didn't believe the state when they said it wasn't Clotilda. I mean, I had many people saying to me, they're lying, right? That is it. And I had to say, no, it's not it. It's too long. We know how long Clotilda was. And, there was another 30 or 40 feet of this ship buried in the mud. It was much too long. So I left that meeting, and all the archaeologists that had come as part of the Slave Wrecks project left town. And there was no, the Clotilda was still missing. And so I was very confident in my 12 Mile Island research, and I really believed that's where it was because I had it straight out of the mouths of two people who were there that night. So then I hired the.
But were you also, but just for clarity, were you tipped on this? Like, did
No.
one of the Mir brothers tip you and say, hey,
No.
because that's
I will tell you there
and
was.
You tell the story that one guy called you and told you, a friend of the Mir said, that's not it. And he told you that, and he was like, that's not it. But did he give you like any more additional information around?
No, but there was another guy. The first time I heard 12 Mile Island. So I mentioned this friend of mine called me and told me to look for the Clotilda. So I did, I got hooked on the story right then, and I started doing all the research. So I called a fellow named Russell Ladd, who just died actually last week. Really wonderful guy. Has spent his whole life in the Delta. His family had a camp up there since he was a boy, in the 40s, and he knows a lot about it, and he grew up with the Mayors. And so I called him, and I said, Russell, I got a question for you. And he said, okay. I said, do you have any idea where the Clotilda is? And he said, well, Daddy always said it was at 12 Mile Island. So that was my first 12 Mile Island tip. And so then as I found the captain's journal and the interview with Cujo that were also 12 Mile Island. So that was the only, he was not a Mayor family member, and he was just saying, well, Daddy always said, but he wasn't saying he'd seen it or knew where it was or anything like that. So, I had those three elements as pointing toward 12 Mile Island. So I was very confident that it was at 12 Mile Island. And at that meeting, where it was announced that the first ship wasn't the ship, Thelma came up and gave me a hug and sang this gospel song in my ear. There's a bright side somewhere. Don't give up until you find it. And she told me to keep looking for the ship, which, felt like being given a mission, And then I turned from her and walked a few feet away. And these two other guys came up to me who were marine archaeologists who had been hired by the state to look for these two ironclad Civil War Confederate ships that were intentionally sunk in the Mobile River, which right next to Africatown, in fact. In fact, these two ships were sunk right across from the bridge, just a little bit above the Africatown Bridge. So they had been hired to look for them, and they told me, well, since we were already there with all of our survey equipment, we went up to the bottom of 12 Mile Island, and we didn't find it. And so right then I knew that, okay, somebody has looked with modern survey equipment below 12 Mile Island, and I knew that this historian, Jack Friend, a Mobile kind of eccentric, had spent tens of thousands of dollars of his own money looking everywhere Timothy Mayer suggested the ship was, but he started at the north end of 12 Mile Island. So nobody had ever looked right where I had these two sources saying the ship was, two guys who were there the night the ship was burned. So I had the University of Southern Mississippi come, and we did a full bathymetric survey with a side scan sonar that looks, on the bottom, a sub-bottom profiler, which looks under the mud in case the ship was buried in the mud, and then a magnetometer that finds metal objects. And those old wooden ships were held together with these huge nails, this long, giant iron that really show up on a magnetometer. So we found 11 hits, and it took about a week for them to correlate their data to where you could look at it as a chart, to study where in the river they were and have GPS coordinates that matched and all that. So the next week, we went back out. Now, this is 2 weeks after the meeting where they announced it wasn't the ship. We went back out and we checked everything we had found that could possibly be Clotilda. And by the end of the day, we had ruled out everything in the river except this one ship that turned out to be Clotilda. And it actually wasn't something we were going to look at first. They had not marked it on their survey for some reason. And we were on the boat, and I had a guy from a dive shop there, and I was looking at the survey at the end of the day, and he said, "What's that?" And he pointed at this shape that looked like a shoe on the survey map. And I said, "It looks like a shoe." And he said, "Not to me, that looks like a ship." And he and I have been diving on many sunken ships out in the Gulf of Mexico, and we have to find them with the same technology to dive on them and stuff. So we got the coordinates from the lab back in Mississippi, and we went to that spot. And by the end of that day, we knew we had found a ship, and we knew from the lab that it was about 90 feet long and about 28 or 29 feet wide. Clotilda is 86 by 27. So, I informed the state after that. We found another ship from the 1850s, and it is the exact dimensions of the Clotilda, and it's the only thing at 12 Mile Island that could possibly be the Clotilda. We found the ship that day. There's no debate about that. We had the GPS coordinates. We gave them to the state. We gave them to National Geographic. We gave them to Search Incorporated. For some reason, so they came and they started investigating the ship. They came 4 months later and immediately started diving on the ship. For some reason, a year later, when they announced that it was the Clotilda, National Geographic decided to leave me out of the story entirely. And so did the state of Alabama in their press releases. I don't know why. I think it was really weird. I've documented all of that. I left it out of the book because I felt like it took away from the power of the story some. But I did write an article for Lagniappe, our local alternative weekly, for anybody who wants to read about what actually happened with National Geographic. I mean, I had to threaten to sue them for libel. The head of National Geographic, this woman, Susan Goldberg. And it just kind of was, it was so distressing because all that was happening was they were trying to get control of the ad revenue related to the story about Clotilda, which was worth tens of millions of dollars. And they wanted to cut me out because I was a journalist. They didn't want me to get any of the credit or my company I worked for at the time. And I found that really depressing. It was, one more group trying to take advantage of the Clotilda legacy. And I think that was shameful. To understand what I'm talking about with the ad revenue, so and National Geographic had gotten on my boat. They had taken portraits of me. They had interviewed me. They knew I found the ship. They just chose to leave me out. And their chief archaeologist explained it to me on the boat before this had happened. He said, "Well, we're really excited about the Clotilda story. We just had our story about the tomb of Christ and going into the tomb of Christ. And it was our first story on the internet that generated 1 billion hits on the internet." Well, the way the internet works for media companies, if every 1,000 hits is worth about $6. So take 1 billion hits and divide that by 1,000 and multiply that by $6. And you see, we're talking tens of millions of dollars in ad revenue. And that's what it was about. National Geographic was trying to get all that gold related to the Clotilda into their coffers. And even to the point of hiding the true story of how it's found. And from my perspective, the fact that a native-born Alabamian found the ship in this state, which has had such a fraught racial history, is a huge part of the story that should be told, because we're I don't know, the whole adventure of the ship happened here in Alabama, and the people left behind lived here in Alabama. And so I just thought that was a real tragedy that that's how they chose to behave.
Does it anger you that you are not involved or included in things going forward related to Clotilda? When I say going forward, I'm talking about from the archaeologist and marine biology's perspective.
It's disappointing, and it's to their shame, not mine. I'm involved with the parts of the Clotilda legacy going forward that really matter, which are, the effort to make a museum in Africatown, the effort to tell the story of the people on board, and the effort to lift Africatown up. Ooh, I guess my little light shade fell off. Let me stick that back on. To tell the story, of these people. That's what's important to me. So I don't really care that I'm not part of National Geographic's documentaries and stuff. I've gotten so much out of being a part of this story, emotionally and professionally, no question. I've got to write this book and all that. But my personal journey during the, hunt for the ship and the finding of it, and then trying to understand the power of the legacy of the Clotilda and the people on it, worth so much more to me than being a part of anything National Geographic is doing. I mean, I don't care about that.
So, one other thing, the iconic picture that was in the Mobile Press Registry of you in your diver's suit and holding up a piece of wood, is that iconic picture, is that Clotilda? Is that an artifact from Clotilda?
That is the first piece of Clotilda to see the light of day in 160 years. That moment. And, that was quite a moment. And I held that piece up, and you could see those square nails coming out of it, which was our first tip that the ship was from the right era, because those are handmade nails made by blacksmiths, because we didn't have, in the 1850s, you couldn't go buy nails, at the hardware store. So that's what that's a picture of. That piece of the ship is the first piece of the ship that Jim Delgado touched. And he touched it sitting on the deck of my boat 4 months later. He said to me at the time, Ben, if you manage to go down here and find Clotilda this time, I'm going to make sure everybody in the world knows you did it. And then he totally didn't do that. He did the exact opposite. But
where's that piece now? Who has that piece?
That piece, Jim Delgado at the site the day he got to hold it had the search diver guys put it back underwater on the ship. I was with a team of scientists when we found it, and we had stashed 3 pieces up in shallow water and secured them there where we knew they would stay there until we could, because we didn't want to go put them back. We wanted to be able to show the archaeologists what we had found. And so they picked them up and moved them 20 feet from where they were in the shallow water back onto the ship. Some of the pieces that we found are the pieces that you saw in that National Geographic documentary. I was sort of stunned at how little has occurred in the 4 years since this all began. I found the ship in April of 2018. They still haven't done any meaningful archaeological work at the site. They have talked about all this stuff, but they've done nothing. Ship is still sitting there in the mud, and the state keeps talking about leaving it there forever. Preserving in situ. You keep hearing them say that. That's just not what should happen to this piece of history.
Let's talk about that. Because you and I disagree on some of this. And just to be fair, I have interviewed Stacey Harthorne, state archaeologist,
Sure.
And she's provided me with kind of what this next phase is, how this is a phased approach. And we all know you can't just go in there and dig up a ship and bring it out there. And then you have to find funding and all of that. So there's an alternative to what you just shared. Now, you and I have disagreed on this, and I thought it would be good conversation for today's show, in that you've been very vocal, and you've even, and Darren Patterson, president of the Clotilda Descendants Association, have both been very vocal on this idea of bringing up the ship. And you've done many interviews about that, about how they need to bring it up and it needs to be housed in this museum and in Africa Town. Where I disagree with you about is as a descendant, because I am a descendant, so not all descendants want the ship brought up. We have to be clear when you speak.
Sure,
so I would ask that you clean that up, that some descendants want the ship up. But you did in your book, you actually almost convinced me to change my mind. But I said, no, I'm still going to stick with my gut, because spending all of that money to go out and get up a ship, and then for the conversation to continue to be on us bringing up the ship, which I don't think that's your intent, but that's what people hear, is the conversation now on this ship. And for me as a descendant, the narrative needs to be on the 110 people, enslaved Africans that were aboard Clotilda. And I think when you, Darren Patterson, and others continuously speak about Clotilda, the ship, and bringing it up without including the 110, it changes the narrative to Clotilda. So as a descendant, my concerns are the narrative continuously being on Clotilda the ship, as well as to some degree on Africatown. And I think it really should be on the 110 enslaved Africans that were aboard Clotilda. So I'll pause there to let you rebut
I think I don't think what you said was necessarily fully fair about what I keep saying. What I'm promoting is we dig the ship up, we put it in a big museum, a world-class museum in Africatown that tells the story of the people who arrived on the Clotilda. And the reason.
But see, that's the piece but that latter part, I don't see that told a lot. Then
you need to read the articles I've been writing.
Well, I'm saying the headlines I see are, we need to bring up Clotilda. We need to do this. And that's the headline, right? Most people, I read your articles, but that's buried in the article. That's where I disagree with you, but I'll let you.
But the article is building to this idea that I think, and I think other people support this idea too. And I think maybe I came up with this phrase. I think the museum should be called the National Monument to the Enslaved. And the people on the Clotilda are the representatives of all the enslaved people stolen from Africa, 12 million people, and sent to both of the Americas. Because with the Clotilda people, it's the only chance in history we have to tell the whole story. From when they were captured in Africa, we can tell the story of their lives before they were captured, the kind of cultures they came from. We can tell what happened to them during the African slaving raids, which, this is part of what I was talking about with the book. I knew nothing about that when I started researching the book. I was taught in school that white people went to Africa with nets and threw them over Africans and brought them back, which is insulting and demeaning.
Dr. Duke does a good job in her book of telling those stories.
Well, sure. But, to get into how industrialized the slavery business was on the African side, the museum would talk about that. From the people on the Clotilda, these are some of the only firsthand accounts we have of being captured in an African slaving raid, living in a barracoon, surviving the Middle Passage, and then enslavement, and then what happened afterward and how they fought back, they rose up, they built this community. That story, because this happened so late in history, 1860, the Civil War, they were enslaved during the Civil War. So their story is the story of the entire African diaspora all over the world. The things that happened to them that they were able to tell us about firsthand, we have film of Cudjo Lewis. That's incredible. So their story is the story of everybody whose ancestors were enslaved. And that's why, to me, their story is told in this museum, but the ship is a critical part. Lamar Howard in the book, I quote him saying, when I went to the Lorraine Motel and saw where they shot Dr. King, I cried. That's the same thing that's going to happen to people when they see this ship. They're going to cry. And he says, that saying, the truth will set you free, that ship is the truth. Every black person in America, their ancestors arrived here in the hold of a ship like that. And that's his quote. To me, that is so powerful and so potent. So when I see it, I see this museum, and there's the ship in a big empty room. It's dark, it's spooky, it's somber. And then the rest of the museum celebrates the story of these people. And it does it in Africatown, the community they founded. And then the ship becomes not this totem of misery that it is right now, sitting on the bottom of the river. It becomes part of this vehicle that can help resurrect Africatown and forever tell the story of the 110 people on the Clotilda. Because this moment where there's still this media attention on the ship, it's going to die away, and people are going to pay less and less attention. I don't think you're going to see a museum telling the story of the people on the Clotilda without a ship as part of the package, as part of the attraction. So to me, that 42-acre housing project site, Happy Hills, the Josephine Allen site in Africatown, which is already owned by the city and was land stolen from Africatown residents through eminent domain to build the housing project, repurpose that land to this 42-acre compound that has this museum with the ship in it, which becomes instantly an international tourism draw. And then you can build a commercial district around it to replace the one destroyed in Africatown that's right there with the museum, businesses, shops, selling, African goods, American goods related to Clotilda and all that stuff. You could even have, new residential housing in there. It's 42 acres. You could have a lake with a replica of the Clotilda floating in it that people could go walk on and see what the ship was like, all at this one stop. Right now in Benin, in Africa, where everybody on the Clotilda came from, the Smithsonian has partnered with the French government to build two $25 million museums in Benin about that country's history and its role in slavery. And here we are talking about the most complete story of enslaved people in the history of the world and the ship that brought them from their homeland to America. It's all here. I think the ship is a critical part to getting to tell the story of the people on the Clotilda in a way that people will know it forever.
But Ben, everything you just said, I agree with. I mean, you did an excellent job of illustrating and describing what should be in the museum. I agree with all of that. And where it should be, the location of it, it's well thought out. The point that here's my perspective. There's going to be a cost associated with getting the ship out of there. If that cost, we don't know that. But if that cost,
it'll be $10 million.
If that cost takes away from building the museum, why not use that cost to build the museum and also house the museum with the artifacts that we can get from the ship? Why does it have to be the whole ship? Why can't it be artifacts that are pulled from the ship that help tell that story?
I think you want both. I think it's you're thinking about what you can accomplish in relation to pulling up the ship rather than what the history deserves. A lot of times something is impossible until you've actually done it.
That's a fair point, but I'm also looking at it from the perspective of we don't see participation from the city of Mobile. City of Mobile is not going to fund this.
Absolutely.
So where are you going to get
the funding?
Where are you going to get the funding from? And who?
I am working on that right now, to tell you the truth. And I think if you look at the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, which is an incredible museum, private funds, no state funding whatsoever. Right. And
there are other organizations. There are other organizations trying to do that too in Africatown as well. Are you?
Sure. And I'm trying to do what I can using the levers I have access to bring in money to do this. To me, 10 to 20 million to dig up the ship is peanuts. Another 20 to 40 million to make an incredible museum. But wait. Ivanka Trump just bought a house for $56 million.
Wait, 10 million? Well, how do you know that it's going to be 10 million to bring up the ship? That's what the phase. So this is the point that Stacey Hawthorne is making, and this is the point where I tend to
build a cofferdam around.
But let me make this point. So because I asked Stacey this question. I said the narrative about you, and I know we got to get close to wrapping up, but I said the narrative about you is that you're setting the stage to essentially let everyone know that you're not going to get the ship up. That's literally what I said there, because that's the narrative that I think you've alluded to.
I believe that's
what interviews. That's what I've heard other people allude to. So I said, so how do you answer that question? And she said, that's not what I'm doing. She said, what she's doing is trying to set the stage for the data to create the best option for preserving the ship. They don't have the data yet. This next phase 2, is supposed to, because I asked her, I said, what does good look like from this phase? She said, what good looks like is that we should determine if we can actually bring the ship up or not. And what's the likelihood of that impacting the preservation of the ship? That's what she said. So what I don't think it's fair to also say we need to bring the ship up if the data says that we can't bring it up. We don't know.
It's not going to say that. That's a red herring. That's a red herring.
How do you know it's not going to say that?
They can dig this ship up. Why on earth would they not be able to dig the ship up? What would
Because it's almost like anything. If
money?
something's in water and if I bring it up, it's going to fall apart. And you don't want to destroy it. That's the point. That's the point that I'm trying to say is, what if they bring it up and you damage it more than how it's being preserved?
Than being burned and dynamited? Look, if it stays in the river, it's lost forever. It's just going to disintegrate.
It's not lost. You can still get, but I still would advocate for going down there and getting as much of it as we can.
All right. Out. So here's where the rubber hits the road with this argument. Okay.
Okay.
Stacy, there is no. I have been involved in underwater work and archaeology and that kind of stuff for a long time, reading about it, participating in it, and stuff like that. The only people I've heard suggest you might not be able to bring up the ship are Jim Delgado and Stacy Haythorn. We have brought up numerous Civil War era ships already that are on display in museums. Confederate ships, not a ship like this. We have saved these Confederate relics and spent tens of millions of dollars doing it, and they're on display in Mississippi and other places. Confederate warships. You can't tell me we can't dig up this last slave ship that is in 20 feet of water in a river. You couldn't ask for a much better environment to do this kind of work in. It's just not true to say there's a possibility that it's impossible to dig up the ship. That is just not reality. The only way to do the archaeology of the ship properly is to build a cofferdam around it, which is you put pilings in the water and you make a circle that's watertight, and then you suck the water out of that circle. And so the ship is then dry at the bottom of the river, 20 feet down, and you can go in there without scuba gear, with shovels and toothbrushes, and dig up everything out of it. The only alternative to a cofferdam is to go in there with big vacuum hoses. And this is what the state has already gotten a contract. They've gotten an engineering firm has a contract to do what I'm about to talk about, which will possibly lose many of the relics and the chance of recovering DNA. They are trying to go in there and suck all the mud out with these vacuum hoses to quickly get the artifacts. And I think the only reason to do it that way is if you want to have a National Geographic documentary about it. The right way to do the archaeology is build the cofferdam. And it's the same way you'd have to do it to dig up the ship. You build the cofferdam around it. This is how we build bridges. This is not complicated technology. We're in 20 feet of water in a river. We're not dealing with waves. We're not dealing with tidal. That's the way to do it, to preserve the artifacts. Now, if you want to get the DNA out of this hull, like you've heard them talk about, vacuuming it up underwater when the water is still there, you're going to lose all of that, because as soon as they get the mud out, that DNA is going to be compromised and disappeared. The DNA, if it exists, is trapped in between the planking in the bottom of the ship, where blood and feces and things would have settled during the voyage and worked its way down into those cracks and crevices and then been covered with mud when the ship was sunk and locked in there. But if you go in there with vacuums underwater with divers in that muddy brown water and they can't see what they're doing, you're going to lose all those chances. So, this phase, all that stuff, they're talking about the stability of the river bottom and all that. That's just them stalling and laying the groundwork for, it's not honest to me. Now, how did I learn about this cofferdam approach as the right way to do it? Jim Delgado told me the first time he came to the Mobile River. He said, this is how we would do it. It's been done all over the world. Jim Delgado, at the first meeting with the first ship, Stacy Haythorn said, we're going to dig it up and put it on display in Africatown. And the room cheered. Lisa Jones, the head of the Historical Commission, said that in Africatown in public. Why aren't we hearing that message anymore?
Why can't you work with this team? Why can't you get on that team and you work with them?
They will not talk to me.
So if I facilitated a meeting, You don't think they would talk with you? Because I think you bring up.
They refuse. I call them and they refuse to talk to me. I get a formal written response when I call Lisa Jones or Stacy. I get a formal written paragraph from. I don't get to speak to anybody or anything like that. That's just what happens. They don't want to work with Ben Raines for whatever reason. You know, they've gone around claiming I did an unpermitted search for the Clotilda, as if that's a crime. There was no permit required to look for the ship. They've been lost for 160 years. Many people had looked for the ship, but somehow I did an unpermitted search. Well, what on earth are they talking about? That's absurd. You know, I managed to find this iconic historical artifact, and that's wonderful. You know, the ship is such a powerful icon of our history. The notion that we would let it rot on the bottom of the river forever is just so absurd when you think of what it is. There are a handful of slave ships that have ever been found around the world. This one is more intact than any others. The others have been dug up. You know, there's a piece of a slave ship on display in the Smithsonian's African American History Museum in Washington, D.C. It's about the size of a brick, and it came from a South African ship that sank in a port in Brazil. It had nothing to do with the American slave trade. Here, we have the best preserved, most intact slave ship ever found, adjacent to the community, started by the people who were transported into bondage on that ship. I mean, you couldn't design a better museum to tell the story of enslavement in the Americas than the one that Africatown deserves.
I don't disagree. So we can end it there in that.
All right,
I agree.
I love the conversation. It was fun.
There needs to be a museum. I'm 100% on board. I like your location, and if you can find the funding and the right people to get it up, to pull up the ship and to put it in the museum and it doesn't impact the building of a museum, I say go for it. The only takeaway I would ask is, I agree with you. The body of your emails talks about the 110. If we can change the headlines to be about the 110 that were aboard Clotilda and their story, that's all I'm asking. I'm just figuring out, how do we change the headline so that it doesn't focus on the ship?
The dirty secret of the journalism business is the guy who writes the article doesn't get to write the headline. So I didn't get to write those headlines. But let me leave you with this one thought, and it's from Cujo, all right? And it is him talking about after they were freed and they were building Africatown. And he says, we needed a school for our kids. We didn't wait for the white folks to build us one. We built one for ourselves. That's what needs to happen with this museum. I mentioned the Legacy Museum in Montgomery because it was built with private funds, so the state has no role in it. The state can't shut it down. The state can't control what they say in the museum, the story they tell. This museum in Africatown needs to be the same. It needs to be governed by people with a vested interest in the story like you know, who are descendants, people in the community. That's who needs to control this museum and decide the story it tells, not the Alabama Historical Commission, not anybody else. We build one for ourselves. That's what I want to leave you with.
Well, we build one for ourselves. So then I'm gonna have to have
for the museum, right?
I'm gonna have to have you back. This was a pretty good conversation. I mean, it's obvious your passion for this story, and like I said, I've read the book, and there are some things that I was able to take away and learn from your research. So I appreciate you for that. And so, with that being said, thank you for your time, and thank you for joining today.